Underway. Good morning. I am Amy Blaymore Paterson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. I am going to be looking up and down because that is a bright light, but we do need it. So welcome to the 39th Annual Connecticut Land Conservation Conference. It was March 11th, 2020, just 2 weeks before the conference, that we made the tough decision to cancel. Never did I imagine that we would have to wait 3 years to gather together again to celebrate land conservation here in Connecticut. But we're here. Please take a moment to give yourselves a round of applause and soak this all in. At last count, approximately 550 people from around the state, the region, the country, and even as far away as Tasmania, registered to join us here today, making this once again one of the largest, if not the largest, Land Trust State Association conferences in the country. Thanks. If this is your first time attending a CLCC conference, just raise your hand. Nice, nice. That's another round of applause. So I have a note to myself to hold up the program, and of course, I don't have it up here. So everyone should have gotten a program. Christina, our amazing operations manager, did an outstanding job. Thank you. In organizing the conference, assembling a terrific crew of volunteers, and pulling together a detailed program of the day's events. Please take a moment to study the program, which includes a map in the back of where all the buildings are today. If you need assistance for any reason, please ask any one of our volunteers that are wearing a gray CLCC t-shirt, or you can go to the students that are sitting at the main desk in the USDAN Center. You should also have received a day of announcements handout, and that includes information for tech support, Wi-Fi, presenter access for classroom computers, breakfast, lunch, and snacks, workshops with updates, etc. It's really an important document to take a look at before you feel like you need an answer to a question and you don't know where to find it. Please take a look in there. As you probably know already, breakfast and lunch will be served out of the Mink dining room upstairs. There's only one dining room this year, so please find seats anywhere else you would like downstairs. And then in the third floor of USDAN, we are hosting a young professionals meetup. That's awesome. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Anne-Sophie Pagé, will be up there as well. So I encourage anyone who would like to go upstairs and have a little extra time and mingle with some of our young professionals to go up to the third floor of USDAN for lunch. Evaluations are in each room. You can hand it to your workshop presenter or place it in the boxes by the registration anytime. Your comments matter to the presenters and to us. Collection boxes for these your plastic name tag holders are also at registration. Please return them so that we may reuse them, as we have been doing since 2011. Next year, no more plastic. We're done with that. But more about the name tags in a minute. Our conference is made possible in part thanks to the generosity of our numerous sponsors, many of whom have joined us here today for the very first time. A special shout out to our leadership level sponsors, Connecticut Public, Eversource Energy, Regional Water Authority, Estuary Magazine, the Nature Conservancy, the Trust for Public Land, Decion, plus 78 other conservation partners, including 36 land trusts. Another round of applause, well deserved. We are so grateful to your generosity, which allows us to keep the conference affordable and to offer scholarships to anyone who wishes to attend. I also want to acknowledge the CLCC Board of Directors, CLCC Board Chair Elizabeth Moore. If you're not already standing, please stand, wave so everybody knows who you are, as well as our amazing staff. I want to thank you for your dedication, your support, and friendship. It's my greatest pleasure to work with all of you. Got a little choked up there for a sec. Amidst the challenges and the uncertainties of the past 3 years, Connecticut Land Trust forged on in all facets of their work, all while experiencing an unprecedented surge in the usage of their trails and preserves. There are unsung heroes in communities everywhere, quietly, without fanfare, working hard every day to uphold their land conservation mission and responsibilities. Today, it is with great pleasure that I announce the recipients of CLCC's 2023 Excellence in Conservation Awards. Honorees, including members of your organizations, whether a board member or not, if you're a member, please join them and stand up in honor of this recognition. And audience, please hold your applause until the end. This year, the Cajun Coley Award for Excellence in Conservation goes to Madeline McClave, president of the New Hartford Land Trust, for her exceptional leadership at the helm of the Land Trust, tremendous skills in bringing people together, and passion and persistence in pursuing even the most challenging conservation projects. Not sure Madeline is here. If she is, I hope she's standing. I have a blinding light in my eye. The Excellence in Conservation Award goes to Granby Land Trust, recognizing their tireless commitment and collaboration in preserving the Wilcox and Holcomb farms, an exceptional effort, not only in terms of the conservation, agricultural, and cultural benefits, but also in underscoring the essential role that land trusts play in bringing together community stakeholders and engaging the public in the conservation process. Granby Land Trust folks, please stand up. The Excellence in Community Engagement Award. The Excellence in Community Engagement Award goes to Avalonia Land Conservancy for its innovative and inspiring leadership in offering new programming, communications, and projects that advance inclusive conservation and accessibility, particularly for people with disabilities. Their work is certainly a model for all of us around the state. Avalonia folks, please stand up. And finally, a special award for excellence in conservation goes to the Connecticut River Gateway Commission. We are delighted to recognize the 50th anniversary of the commission and its multifaceted role as a regulator, partner, funder, planner, and more in conserving and protecting land in the lower Connecticut River Valley. Those of you from the Gateway Commission or even in the Valley, please stand up. As we did last year, it was one of those things that emerged through the pandemic. We'll host award presentation celebrations around the state this spring and summer, probably outside. Watch for those announcements in the months ahead and please join us. We will be doing a lot of promotion and we hope that everyone in the state will travel around and view the special places that have been protected by our honorees. Okay, I wrote down, now you can clap it. You've been clapping. So congratulations. So back to your name tag. The stripes, I keep pointing to mine, but I don't have them. But the stripes are a data visualization graphic that shows how the temperature in Connecticut has warmed over the years. One of the many worsening impacts we are living with as a result of the changing climate. We are at a critical point for our planet's future, but you know that. Extreme heat, frequent and destructive storms, flooding and drought conditions, poor air quality, and more, with the hardest hit being low-income and minority communities. We are also experiencing a global biodiversity crisis of epic, and for a growing number of species, irreversible proportion. Earlier this week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 6th assessment report. In it, the world's leading climate scientists offered a stark warning that we need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, or face a, quote, rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all, end quote. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Anne-Sophie Pagé, will share her climate angst, and she is not alone. It's hard to find good news when it comes to the environment. But the IPCC report does not leave us without a path forward towards stabilizing the Earth's climate, though it will require immediate and urgent policy action by governments around the world. This past week, Governor Lamont declared March 22nd through March 29th as Climate Action Week. In his proclamation, the governor recognized that, quote, states and their residents have a unique opportunity to reduce emissions within their borders through their individual and shared actions, end quote. Using our call to action, which you also should have picked up at registration as a guide, please take advantage of Climate Action Week to ask your legislators to support funding and policies that advance climate action, including especially those that recognize the value of land conservation and other nature-based climate solutions. But here's the thing. With the state's forest lands and trees, wetlands and soils among our strongest defenses against climate change, and the loss of biodiversity, land trusts have a unique opportunity to embrace this call to action, not just this week, but every day. How? By doing even more than you are already in communities everywhere. And CLCC is with you every step of the way. Guided by a new strategic plan, CLCC is committed to accelerating the pace and quality of land conservation, building stronger land trusts, and including more people along the way. In the coming months, we will unroll details of programs that expand community conservation and technical assistance, provide direct financial support for acquisition and stewardship, and engage in deeper advocacy to elevate land conservation as a critical solution to the challenges we face today and into the future. So where do we find good news? For a start, it's right here in this room with all of you. We have years, not decades, to act. So together, let's rise to the occasion and turn the challenges of our time into opportunities to strategically, expeditiously, and inclusively pursue the protection and stewardship of lands that benefit all. Thank you all so much for everything that you do and for being here with us today. Andy, why don't you come on up? Come on up, Andy. And now to close out our welcome, it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Fisk, the new chief of Connecticut Deep's Bureau of Natural Resources, whom many of you know from his exceptional work as the immediate past executive director of the Connecticut River Conservancy. And I can guarantee you he does not need the step stool.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with all of you today. It's great to see old friends and colleagues, and I look forward to making many more friends and colleagues. It's an honor for me to be in another seat doing the good work for the public, and I am honored and grateful to have another opportunity to be a public servant working with Connecticut Deep. I have 3 words today and very brief remarks. Those words are gratitude, forever, and imagination. Gratitude. I am incredibly grateful as a person, a public servant, for the work that I am staring in this room today. The Land Trust and the land conservation movement in Connecticut, New England, and around the country has done amazing work, and I am incredibly grateful for the movement. I'm incredibly grateful for all of you, volunteers, staff members, who have contributed time, treasure, and heart to this work. And that is incredibly powerful, and it's inspiring to all of us who work within public agencies and other places. So know we are always grateful for the commitment that you make. We are also grateful for your engagement with our work. We are grateful that you lean in. We are grateful that you partner with us, and we are grateful for your support for the mission at DEEP. I will say that part of my work here at DEEP, part of it is about partnership. And I am extremely committed, having come from a nonprofit seat, to know that the work of my agency includes building social capital. And there is tremendous social capital in this room. And my job is to make sure that DEEP improves how it works with our partners. And there are places where we are not doing as well as we could. And I am grateful for the Land Trust and the land conservation community when you lean in respectfully and we have conversation to say, how can we do better at DEEP? So let's continue that conversation. Forever. All of you and us are in the forever business. And I know when I was working in land conservation at a local land trust in Maine and in the Connecticut River Conservancy, sometimes that word was incredibly terrifying because you are all making commitments to hold land and those conservation values forever. And there are also times that I know that it is incredibly inspiring, and the challenge that you have all taken on your shoulders to do this work forever is incredibly powerful. The forever work and in our partnership is really about you are setting the stage. And I had a dear friend who said, land conservation is all about the stage and is the stage upon which so much other work can happen. And so looking into forever, I am grateful for the innovation, the challenge, and the work that the land conservation community does on the properties that you are holding forever. And I would encourage you to continue to think over that long term And there may be days when you think, oh my gosh, what have I gotten into, and the challenges, but to remember that you play an incredibly important part and your partnership is so incredibly powerful. And as I sit in a state government seat, state government cannot do all this work. And it goes back to that point of building, encouraging, sustaining partnerships. Imagination. Did I say that was the third word? Did I say grateful, forever, and imagination? Okay, just checking. Imagination. There are times when, I'm sure in your work, I know in mine, when the vantage is really close hold and you're looking at the details, the challenges, constructing a deal, figuring out financing, creating a baseline document. I would ask you to never forget the power of imagination, because when this movement started, it was imagining a future that said we can do better, and we imagine a future where our environment is stronger, better, and more sustaining for ourselves and all the critters that live in it. And I reflect on the legal imagination, and just one example of the power of imagination, an easement. That came from legal imagination, and it created a legally defensible instrument that allowed for development rights to be severed from land and held by another organization to meet those purposes. That took imagination. And as Amy noted, we are in the middle of this climate crisis, and we must endeavor to continue to imagine a very different future. And imagination is far more powerful than technical knowledge. Imagination is far more powerful than some realistic assumption of what you might do. It should sustain us all. And I know when I'm having a rough day, or I think something really isn't feasible, I go back to that point of imagination and remember where people said, I'm not going to be bound by reality for the moment. I'm going to cast a vantage that looks far out over that horizon. And damn it, I'm going to commit my life, my time, and my energy to that vision. So to the entire land trust community across the nation and all those people who imagined new instruments, new ways of doing things, all right. And please hold that imagination and hope that it sustains you in the forever work that you do. And remember, in state government, we are always grateful for the work you do, and we appreciate the fact that you lean in, and we look forward to a continued partnership and doing far more and far better work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, so much. We really look forward to working with you here in Connecticut. I am now honored to introduce you to Dr. Anne-Sophie Pagé, who journeyed across the world to join us. Oh, wait a minute. Now we're talking. If you haven't already read about Annie in our program, please do, and prepare to be awestruck. You are likely wondering how she came to be here today. In November 2019, Elizabeth Moore and I traveled to coastal Patagonia as part of an Earthwatch expedition. We spent 5 days assisting scientists trailing Magellanic penguins, studying changes in their behavior in response to climate change, overfishing, and other environmental challenges. Among our group was Anne-Sophie, then a veterinary student who was researching the impacts of climate change on endangered bird species in her native country of New Zealand. As a student, Annie was determined to make a difference in the world through her work as a scientist and an activist. She shared with us during that brief time together her philosophy of the Maori, the indigenous population of New Zealand, who believe that the key to saving our environment is through the concept of Kaitiakitanga, which teaches us that we all have an obligation to be guardians and protectors of the land. She truly was an inspiration. And when Elizabeth and I asked Annie to join us at the 2020 conference as our keynote speaker, we were amazed that she didn't hesitate. Of course, we had to wait 3 years, but here she is. Now a veterinarian and global environmental activist residing on the northwest coast of Tasmania. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anne-Sophie Pagé as the 2023 Connecticut Land Conservation Conference keynote speaker.
Yeah. I'll click it or anything. Thank you. Where do I point it? Okay, next slide. Cool. Can we get rid of those up the top too, possible? Oh. All right, I'll just make that. Oh. So, ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kāka, ka tangi huki aho. Ko puki mata toku monga, ko ofeo toku awa, ko Pagé toku hapu no hera weka aho. Ko Annie toku ingoa, no rera tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora. So I just recited to you my Māori mihi. In English, it translates as the sooty shearwater voices its presence, as the kāka voices its presence, so too do I. Harbour Cone is my mountain, the Leith is my river, Pagé is my family, I am from Broad Bay. My name is Annie, welcome once, welcome twice, welcome 3 times over. So in New Zealand, we introduce ourselves a bit differently. Instead of outlining my hobbies and my interests, I start with my mountain, progress to tell you about my river and my ocean, and then eventually I finish with my name. So the environment is very much an identity in our world, and I kind of want to share that with you today. So a bit about New Zealand. We're right down the bottom of the southern hemisphere. I grew up on the bottom of the South Island. And we're a unique place. We separated from Gondwana land about 80 million years ago. Yes? Oh, yep. Yeah, cool. So yeah, we separated from Gondwana land about 80 million years ago. And at that point, the only creatures that were found there were birds and reptiles, a few insects, and a few frogs. At that point, no mammals had made it there, apart from one species of bat. The only mammals that eventually came were from the ocean. So we have a few species of whale, dolphins, and pinnipeds, so your sea lions and seals, but otherwise no endemic land mammals. In fact, about 44% of our seabirds, 90% of our insects, about 80% of our terrestrial birds, and 70% of our freshwater fish are only found in New Zealand. And due to the lack of native man mammals, they evolved in a way that meant that when mammals eventually were introduced, they were very vulnerable. So many of our birds are flightless, for example. And because of that, when the Māori first arrived about 750 years ago from a group of islands in Polynesia, they brought with them a type of rat and a type of dog, which started this extinction episode that happened on our shores. But it was the European arrival about 250 years ago that really set things off. A lot of our biodiversity is really struggling at the moment, and we've been through one of the worst extinction episodes in recent history. Next slide. So a bit about me. I've had a bit of a unique childhood. My mother is a marine biologist. She's nuts about seaweed. My dad used to be an underwater archaeologist, diving on shipwrecks actually up off Canada near the Arctic. And he used to photograph for National Geographic as well. So growing up, the priority in our household was the ocean. I learnt to tell the gender of a crab before tying my shoelaces and lead a full-scale shark dissection before learning how to cook a dinner. So we used to get weird looks from the neighbours from my mum drying seaweed on the clothesline. And I used to resent it a little bit, I'm not going to lie, but all it took was spending about a month on the ocean for me to really realise it's part of who I am. And everything from now on has been sort of in recognition of that. Next slide. So my journey truly started for me at 16 years old when I was given the opportunity to fly over Antarctica. I developed an emotional connection with the ice, and everything since then has been an effort to keep it like this. Next slide. So I guess there's two priorities in my life. The first is, as you can see here, to develop an emotional connection between individuals and our environment, with the hope of developing a concept of kaitiakitanga, which means guardianship in the face of climate change. And the second is using my career as a veterinarian to help mitigate the biodiversity crisis that we're currently in. Now, this photo here was actually taken in Patagonia, where I met Amy. This man to my left was a guy called John. He was a software developer from the United States and had much time out in the wilderness. And he was with us for about 5 days. And the transformation of him from the start to the finish was truly, truly inspiring. Down there on those shores, we found the center of an ecosystem. In fact, that day was the highest amount of wildlife I've ever seen in my life. We had whales, we had dolphins, we were surrounded by penguins. There were alpacas all around us, guanacos is what they call them. And it was just the most emotional place I've ever been. We were both crying our eyes out. And it really honed into me the power of being in a natural space and being surrounded by the wild, and how transformative it is for people. Next slide. So I guess my talk today, I guess this is really where I think the biggest barrier is at the moment, where we're facing climate change and the biodiversity crisis. I'll let you read it, but essentially how are we going to, it's a cultural transformation that we need to go through. Science will only get us so far, but how do we change mindsets? How do we change actions? How do we change practices? And I think this is really where we are lost. We are so lost. And I'm hoping through today it's something that keeps me up at night. And I'm hoping that I can share my beliefs and values with you today, and maybe get you to think about it too. Ooh. Next slide. So in summary, this is my knowledge basket. In Māori terms, it's called a kete. And today I'm going to be sharing all of my causes of my what I call green angst, environmental angst, intertwined with my experiences over the past few years. Next slide. So my first cause of green angst is the fact that climate change the climate crisis is here right now. It's not happening in a few years' time. We're living the effects of it every day, right here, right now. For a long time, it's been viewed as something that, it's something we're going to have to address in the future, 10, 20, 30 years down the track, but that's not the case anymore. Next slide. So this is a recent study that was conducted by Yale, the climate change, Yale program on climate change communication. And it sort of outlines in summary really that mindsets are changing, which is good. We need that mindset change to be able to bring about, mitigation for climate change. But yeah, on the whole, a lot of Americans are finally starting to, and I'm assuming this applies to the rest of the world too, that we are slowly accepting where we are at the moment. Next slide. So how is climate change impacting our planet? Would people be keen to share some of their thoughts on that? Yeah, that's a good one. Any others? Wendia, yep. Yes, thank you. That's one that's not a common one to be brought up, but it's the one that scares me the most. Yep, flooding. Yep, cool. Yep, awesome. So there's a lot. It's we could be here all day discussing of all of the impacts that's going to start happening, but we'll progress. Next slide. So a few of my examples. When I was about 11 years old, I was very lucky to go to French Polynesia with my family. And that was my first experience witnessing a coral reef. And I remember dressing up in my snorkel gear, putting my head underwater and be completely overwhelmed by the colors that confronted me, to the point I pretty much forgot my name. A few years ago, however, I joined my mother on some research at the Great Barrier Reef, and the difference from 11-year-old to now was soul destroying. It was really, really upsetting. This is a photo I took on a spring tide on one of the reefs where we were staying, and you can see it's just mounds of rock, really. There's a few resilient coral that are adapting to those changes and are making a comeback, but on the whole, there's not much left. Next slide. Another example, it was 65 degrees Fahrenheit in Antarctica in summer of 2020. That's the highest recorded temperature so far down there, but they're finding that it's ever increasing each summer. Elephant seals used to be quite common where I grew up, but they're nowhere to be seen anymore. They're going much further south to try and get away from the heat. Next slide. So Royal Albatross that I grew up about 5 minutes down the road from where they've been nesting. In the past 2 years, their fledging rates have halved chicks. Next slide. And then you've probably heard of the devastating Australian bushfires of 2020. As a veterinarian working in Tasmania, we deal with wildfires regularly. We're in the process of developing a mobile unit to be deployed at any time to any of the national parks that catch on fire to manage burnt wildlife victims. But it's something that is just going to become a matter of life very quickly. Next slide. So the timeline of damage, we're currently sitting about 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The recent IPCC report says by 2030, we're expected to meet the 1.5 mark. So that's what, it's 2023, that's 7 years away. What does it mean? Next slide. So I've kind of broken down what this all means. We're currently sitting about here. So you're seeing that we've already made it. We're at the stage where, it's going to happen regardless of what actions we take now. We're already seeing extreme weather, destruction of ecosystems, ocean acidification is already in place, and disease spread. I'll share some examples with you later on, but going on here, it just gets scarier. Next slide. So throughout this talk, I kind of want to outline some of the stuff I've been doing over the past few years. In 2017, I guess the climate journey started for me with being invited to be involved with the Tari expeditions. This is a very famous boat in New Zealand. You guys are, I'm assuming, aware of the America's Cup. We're rivals in that respect, but one of our very famous New Zealanders, Sir Peter Blake, who won us the America's Cup multiple times, after he retired from sailing, he became a bit of an environmental activist and sailed the oceans on this boat. He was tragically killed in the Amazon by pirates on one of those advocacy missions aboard this boat. And after he died, it was sold to the French, and it's now used as a climate change research vessel. It's a special boat because it's got an aluminium hull, so it can't be compressed by ice. It's also got it's got a keel that lifts up. So in the next slide, what it means is it can be locked in ice without being compressed. So this is one of the first voyages that the French did with this boat. They sailed to one end of the Arctic, got locked in the ice, and drifted across the ice shelf to the other side. So it was done about 100 years before them. It took about 3 years for that boat to go from one side to the other. But when the Tara did it, it only took 1.5 years. So in the space of 100 years, the rate of ice melt across the Arctic has doubled. Next slide. This is the voyage I was involved with, so Tara Pacific. What they were doing is looking at getting an understanding of how coral reefs and plankton are responding to climate change and using them as biomarkers as kind of establishing ocean health. So essentially what they did is traveled thousands and thousands of kilometers, did about 5,000 dives, sampled about 32 locations across the Pacific coral reef atolls. And it was a really big effort over about 2 years that they did this. I was involved in the leg between Fiji and New Zealand. Next slide. But essentially what they were looking at two things. They were looking at ocean acidification and coral bleaching. So raise of hand, how many of you know about coral bleaching? Yeah, quite a strong representation there. So the ocean absorbs about 90% of the heat from the greenhouse effect. So it's hugely important in regulating our temperatures and keeping them cool. However, the consequence of that is the ocean is warming. Now, upon coral, what gives coral its colour is algae. And that's a very important symbiotic relationship. Now, the algae, when this temperature is rising, it gets stressed and it leaves the coral, and the coral obtains about 90% of its energy from the algae. So when the algae leaves, the coral essentially dies. So very important relationship there that's being disturbed. Another thing that we were looking at was ocean acidification. So who here knows about ocean acidification? Who's heard of it? Much lesser representation. About 1 in 5 people have heard about it. And like I said before, it's one of the things that stresses me out the most about climate change. So just like ocean warming, the ocean absorbs a huge amount of carbon dioxide. It's very important in keeping those carbon dioxide levels low. But the consequence of that is the higher amount of carbon dioxide levels in the ocean, it becomes more acidic. Now, another compound found in the ocean is carbonate, which essentially makes up your coral structures, your shells, your skeletons of marine life. And when the ocean becomes more acidic, it dissolves the carbonate, essentially. So what we're finding is as this ocean pH gets lower, the shells, the skeletons, the coral is dissolving. Next slide. This is the result. Next slide. Now, why is that important? Why are we concerned about that? Well, it will cause a huge mass extinction episode, but more so, we're worried about plankton. So plankton is the grass of the ocean. For every 2 breaths you take of oxygen, 1 comes from trees, plants, the other comes from plankton. It is also founds the basis of the food chain. So we're finding that a lot of these plankton, you know, your coccolithophores, your copepods, they're all made up of carbonate. And with this acidifying ocean, they're dissolving. So it means that they can't carry out their process of photosynthesis. They can't absorb carbon dioxide. It's a negative cycle. There's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a result. We're getting less oxygen. And all of these other creatures that rely on plankton are losing a food source. Next slide. So yes, a big part of this trip was sampling coral, doing a lot of diving, but in these stints between the islands, we were dragging this big net behind us, collecting a huge amount of plankton and sending it off to laboratories across the world, essentially creating a library of all of the plankton species and how they're responding to ocean acidification. Next slide. The other great thing about this boat is there was a lot of scientists on board, but there was also journalists, there was youth, there was artists, there was photographers. A big thing about climate change research is it's complicated. There's a huge gap in, the knowledge that we're developing as scientists and relaying that to the public, getting that emotional response. And the whole science communication, I can't emphasize enough how important that is going forward. These guys were really trying to combat that by doing the photography, the artists, the thank you, the journalism and all that sort of stuff to make it more relevant to your everyday citizen. But while they were also landing at all these different countries, they opened up the boat for people to come on board and learn. Next slide. So in summary, this is what we found. It's not very good news. They're finding by the end of the century, there'll be an increase in ocean acidification or ocean acidity by 100 to 150%. If that's the case, will probably lead to one of the biggest mass extinction episodes in the past 50 million years. It's something that, there's not a huge amount we can do apart from reduce our carbon dioxide levels. Yeah, it's not good news, unfortunately. Next slide. Okay, so the next few cases I want to talk about is, wildlife interactions I've had working as a wildlife guide, but also as a veterinarian. These albatross live about 5 minutes down the road from where I grew up. They're pretty special birds. They're a flagship species for climate change because they're impacted by the subantarctic birds. They like the cold weather. The more wet, the windier, the colder it is, the better they do. However, we're finding with these species here that they're dying of heat exhaustion. So the adults, while they're incubating the nest during the summer, it's so hot, they're not doing well, they can die. Behind you'll see on this photo, there's a hose pipe there. That's the start of an irrigation system that we've got on the headland. We'll turn that on the really hot days. It's a sprinkler shower to keep the birds cool. Thank you. Next slide. But the main issue that we're finding with these birds is the chicks. So it's hot outside, but the ground temperature is even hotter. And when they're incubating the eggs, it's very important that it's a constant temperature, otherwise they won't hatch. And because, we wanted about 38, 39 degrees Celsius, I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, because the ground temperature is warmer than that, the eggs are just not hatching. So what we're doing is we're actually replacing those fertile eggs with dummy eggs, same shape, size, weight. The adults are none the wiser. We take their fertile eggs, we put them in an incubator for the full 79-day incubation period, and then replace them just before they're about to hatch. So that's how we're trying to mitigate that issue. Next slide. But why is it even happening in the first place? So these albatross, have evolved down in the subantarctic islands. You see here, the vegetation is very different. There's a high water content in those leaves, high moisture with lots of rain daily. The colony that's down the road from where I live, it's mainly your grasses that just trap the heat. So it's the wrong type of vegetation for them. And that plus increased day temperatures is just really, it's not doing well. Next slide. So we're in the process of replanting the headland with this native ice plant, which is, as you see, the leaves are very thick and keep the ground temperature quite a bit cooler with the high water content in there. So that's something we're trying to do as a short-term fix, but it's not going to work long-term for sure. Next slide. Another good example is malaria, avian malaria, and our yellow-eyed penguin. So these are the rarest species of penguins in the world. They're expected to go extinct within the next 10 to 15 years. Their Māori name is hoi ho, which means noise shouter. They're the loudest penguins. You can hear them all across the other side of town. They're really loud. They're special. They're the largest penguins north of Antarctica. but they're also very solitary. So you don't find them in the big colonies like you do the other types of penguins. These guys, they hide in the trees and they don't like to interact. Next slide. The mortality rate of the juveniles is about 80%. The colony that I have worked on last season, they had about 24 juveniles fledge and only one returned. That gives you an idea of how poorly they're doing. There's about 300 breeding pairs on the mainland of New Zealand, and like I say, within the next 10 to 15 years, they're not going to be there. What is one of the reasons why they're not doing well? Well, avian malaria is a recent disease that started emerging. It's transmitted by mosquitoes. You can see here on one flipper I couldn't even attempt to account how many mosquitoes are on there. But the mosquitoes, it's a blood plasmodium or a blood parasite really that invades the red blood cells, and it's transmitted by mosquitoes. So we're finding, next slide. The reason why it's an issue these days is, again, like the albatross, these guys have evolved down in the subantarctic islands where there are no mosquitoes. But with the changing of temperatures, mosquitoes are coming further south and completely decimating these birds. They just have no resistance to it. Next slide. So last season, we had about 29 deaths from avian malaria. It's not much we can do once they get the disease. It's more symptomatic care in hospital. But like I say, it's all about trying to prevent it. So colonies near standing water where there's a lot of mosquitoes, we're trying to translocate them to other areas that are lower risk. And then all of our rehab facilities, we're putting up mosquito nets around them to try and prevent it. Next slide. Another example of how climate change is affecting us today is starvation events. And this is the Magellanic penguin in Patagonia that I met Amy at during that research. So next slide. So these guys are doing a bit better than the yellow-eyed penguins. This colony we were working on, to give you a perspective, was about 9,000 breeding pairs. So much higher than the total population of yellow-eyed penguins. The colony we were working on has been declining, but they're finding that the colonies north and south of that colony are increasing. Now, with climate change, you'd expect that the colonies south are increasing because food is moving to cooler waters, but it's not the case in this one. So it's highlighting really that we don't know how climate change impacts wildlife. We can't just use the logical answers. Ocean currents change completely. There's still a lot that we need to do research on to figure out. Next slide. So starvation events in the yellow-eyed penguins is critical because they go through a yearly molt. So that involves doubling their body weight, coming ashore for about 4 weeks and changing their feathers. During that period, they are not waterproof, so they can't go out to sea to feed. Now, the issue with reduced food is they're already malnourished by the time that they start their molt. So by the time 4 weeks later, after not eating, they're completely decimated. We have a policy that will go out during that time of year, checking all of the nests. If they're about 60% of the expected weight, we'll uplift them and we'll supplementary feed them. Next slide. Why are they not able to find food? Well, increased storm events is a big one. They are visual predators, so increased poor visibility in the water means that they can't find their food as a result of storms, so lots of sediment there. Another reason is, again, you're changing ocean temperatures. Their favourite food in the middle is red cod. That's moving further south to cooler waters. They can't find it as well, so they're having to deal with the blue cod, which is much larger and harder for them to catch. Next slide. So like I said before, if they're a bit underweight, we'll uplift them and we'll supplementary feed them. Last season, we had to do that for about 44% of the population in comparison to the previous year, which was about 17%. So it kind of gives you an idea of how critical the situation is. They take about 2 containers of these fish per day. It's very labour intensive and smelly. But we are getting good success rates at them returning to the wild. Next slide. So this is sort of, in summary, I think what's holding us back. It's climate change is the killer of political careers. It's a long-term issue that people can't see. And, you know, it's hard to, you know, get traction with, you know, politics and that sort of thing from your general public. So it's something that we've, you know, like I said before, that first slide about needing a cultural change. This is really where I think we need to go. Next slide. I'm not sure if it's as big here, but in New Zealand, the school strike for climate has really taken off, or it did right before COVID anyway. And that plus, you know, our response to COVID is proof that we can actually band together and, you know, globally enact massive change. At this stage, we really kind of need a World War III effort to revert where we're going. Yeah, next slide. So moving away from climate change, the next thing that causes my green angst, which again is often a consequence of climate change, is the biodiversity crisis. I want to share a bit more about the animals that I've been working with, because it kind of highlights that, you know, the anthropogenic impacts we're having are not just a result of our increased carbon dioxide levels. We need to branch out a bit further than that. Next slide. So this is, again, a bit of a summary of where things are at with our impeding mass extinction. As a wildlife guide, it's kind of, I feel like I'm on all, you know, a record player, you know, how it just keeps skipping in the same part of the song. And it's just, you know, this is endangered, this is endangered, this is endangered, for all of the things that we see. Next slide. So another example of another creature I've been working with is the rāpuka, or the New Zealand sea lion. Again, this is endangered. It's the rarest species of sea lion in the world. Population of about 12,000 individuals left. They're real characters. So they're the top of the food chain here in New Zealand. They're not scared of humans. Has anyone here been to New Zealand? Yeah. Have you come across these guys? No. You'll find in the southern beaches of the South Island, they'll chase you. You have to be careful. I've been riding my horses on some of the beaches down south, and they've chased me on my horse at a full gallop. Like, they can run about 30 kilometers per hour. They're a bit like your bears, I think. They're quite friendly. They just want to play with you. Like, they don't have hands. They have a mouth, so they occasionally try and nibble you as well. But just to say hello. But we generally tell tourists that if you've got a backpack or a stick, you're safe, and you just hold that out in front of you if you come across one. Next slide. So they start off pretty cute as pups, but as they get older, they're pretty butt ugly. Sometimes I look at them, I'm like, I don't even know if that's a face or your butt that I'm looking at. But so they're pretty gruesome with their habits. Generally, one male will have about 20 females that he's got breeding rights over. The bigger, the uglier, the fatter you are, the more successful you are in your breeding. Generally, it's a fight to the death if you get a challenger to come and get your females. Now, they predominantly breed again down in those subantarctic islands between New Zealand and Antarctica. However, there's a few that have started habitating the southern part of New Zealand. In fact, they were found all across New Zealand before Māori and Europeans arrived, but because they're not afraid of us, they were really targeted by the fur trade and for food by Māori. So they were hunted to pretty much extinction on the mainland. But since them becoming protected, they've made their way back up north, and we've now got about 150 individuals that live up near us. Of that 150, only 20 are female. Now, why such a skewed ratio? The females return to where they were born to breed. So because most of them are born down in the subantarctics, they return down there. However, there was one exception. We called her Mum. In the 1990s, she made her way out north and started breeding on the Otario Peninsula. And she had a series of female pups, and it's just kind of gone off from there. So we do have a very small breeding population up near where I live. But as you can imagine, with such a skewed ratio, those females have a lot of male attention. And it's pretty sad. We often find them dead in the surf after, being climbed on top of by a massive male and drowned and trying to mate. So yeah, it's not a pretty picture for those poor females. They're pregnant most of their lives. They have sole responsibility of taking care of that pup. Males have nothing to do with it. They breed and then they bugger off for a holiday. Next slide. So they generally have one pup every 1 to 2 years. The pups, they live on the beach, but then they're hidden in the forest as they get older. We are trying to microchip all of them to have a record of, the population dynamics on the mainland. But the majority of the pups are born down in the subantarctic islands in about 3 beaches. They're huge breeding beaches, but as you can imagine, all our eggs are in one basket because it's such a small area. And in terms of disease spread, that's a really big issue. So next slide. So this is the project I'm about to embark on, and sort of investigating a really big disease that is wiping out the population. So they've found that their pup numbers have decreased by about 50% in the past 20 years. Why? Klebsiella. So this is a bacteria that we're finding there's more hookworms in the pup's gut. So these have been introduced from dogs. They're damaging the mucosa of the intestines, and then that's allowing the bacteria to gain entry into the bloodstream and causes a horrific meningitis type infection as well as pneumonia, and the pups die within a week. Now, it's a big issue. Like I say, they're only breeding on 3 beaches and huge populations of pups in small areas. So in terms of just like COVID, these big gatherings like we're having today, very easy way to spread disease. And it's the same with these sea lions. Next slide. Sorry. Maybe put your mask on. So yeah, disease is one thing that's impacting these guys. Another thing is your fishing. So these guys, they swim at the levels of squid fisheries and your trawlers, and they're getting, impacted as bycatch. So bycatch accounts for about 1/4 of total world catch. Sea lions is one of the big ones. With the fisheries in New Zealand have been trying to mitigate that by putting in what we call a sled device. So it's this big metal grate in the front of the nest that ejects them out the top. In theory, it's a great idea, but we're finding that a lot of the females are dying of head trauma. Yeah. Not only that, though, they're struggling to find food. We're taking far too much out of the ocean, and yeah, it's impacting everything from, your small fish all the way up to, your big predators like sea lions. Next slide. Moving away from sea lions, we're going back to the albatross, just because I'm a bit obsessed. So these guys, there's a very special story. The colony down the road from where I live, it's called Tairua Head. First albatross was noticed there in 1919. First albatross fledged 1938. And it was all thanks to this man here, Dr. Lance Richdale. He was a local school teacher that started noticing these birds, but, predators and people were stealing their eggs. So he would camp out right next to the nest and protect them for years on end. And thanks to him, we now have a population of about 250 birds, which doesn't sound like much. The main breeding population for the Northern Royals is in the Chatham Islands. That's about 22,000. However, this place here is very special. And the reason for that is it's the only mainland colony of royal albatross in the world. So this is the only place you can see them breed without paying a heap of money to go to an offshore island. And for advocacy for these birds, it's hugely important. Next slide. So here's an aerial shot of the colony. It's got a very significant human history as well. It was a prominent Māori village about 700 years ago, a allowed a vantage point of all the boats coming into the harbour for tribal warfare. It was also where the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, down on that beach. And now, once the Europeans arrived, they stole the land and they turned it into a fortification. So that was for the threat of Russian invasion. I'm not sure why Russians wanted to come to New Zealand. It was all a hoax, nothing to worry about. But it was also used during World War I and World War II. Again, no one just ventured down this far, but it was all for protection. Albatross were there during that time, even while the cannon was being fired, and they decided to stay. So part of the headland has been gifted back to the Māori. I'm hoping that within the next few years, the full headland will be. But the reason why the albatross love it so much is it's much like an island. These guys are crap flyers at taking off and landing from land. So they really need the steep cliffs, high winds, and lots of sides exposed to water to minimize the crash landings. Next slide. Now, why albatross so important to New Zealanders? Well, we're the albatross capital of the world, of about 22 species, about 12 nest in New Zealand. And it's a pretty significant Māori history associated with them too. So this is a village here in the North Island. When the Europeans came and tried to colonise the area, instead of fighting back, this village here, they peacefully resisted. They put albatross feathers in their hair. And they weren't successful, unfortunately, but their practices have been referenced by Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Today, the albatross feather is a symbol of peace, and any feathers we find on the headland is sent back to iwi across the country. Next slide. Now, why do I love albatross so much? Well, to start off with, they're massive. They've got about a 10-foot wingspan. That's the largest known of any bird. When they fly, they lock their joints and they glide, just like a plane. So it's actually very rare that you see an albatross flapping its wings. They spend about 95% of their lives out at sea. The only reason they need land is to breed. If they could, they'd spend most of their full time out there. And they've also got the lowest expenditure of energy in flight of any bird. So their heart rate has actually been recorded to be slower in flight than it is resting on the water. They also, much to my distress, have the lowest reproductive rate of any bird, only one chick every 3 years. Next slide. So I'll tell you a bit of a love story. They tend to mate for life. What happens when they have their chicks, it's a year-long process to raise that chick to a state where it's ready to fledge. And after that, they take a year's holiday. There's so much energy because that chick is so demanding that they need a break. Now, while they're out at sea, they're solitary. But in the month of September, pairs have been known to arrive within minutes of each other. They haven't seen each other all year, but somehow they know to arrive at the same time. I don't know how. During that month, they reacquaint with each other, lots of synchronized flying, lots of preening. It's very romantic. But then, once they get going, male will build the nest, and then she'll lay the egg. It's about a 79-day incubation period. Next slide. So the rangers are out there every day weighing the chicks. The big issue with these guys is they get fly strike when they first hatch. So we put peppermint essence to try and deter the flies and pick them off ourselves. We'll weigh them regularly, supplementary feed them if they're not doing well. Next slide. They grow, they get to about twice the weight of their parents. The reason why they get so big is they need to put a huge amount of energy into growing that wingspan. But then before they fledge, they go on a bit of boot camp to shave off those extra kilos. Once, next slide. Once they fledge, they don't touch land for another 5 years. Yeah, so they spend time off the coast of New Zealand learning how to be an albatross, and they travel about 9,000 kilometres off to the coast of Chile, rich feeding ground there. They spend a lot of time just enjoying themselves, and they come back to breed. Next slide. Now, what do they struggle with? Predation is a big one. This is a different type of albatross. They find that there's a lot of carnivorous mice on this island that come and gnaw away at them while they're breeding on the egg. We haven't had any predatory attacks on our colony because we regularly trap, but that's not to say it's not a risk. Next slide. Longline fishing is a huge issue for these birds. So they're scavengers. They pick up whatever's floating on the surface of the water. If that's attached to a hook, then they get hooked and drown. Yeah. So how can you make a difference in that? Reduce your calamari intake is a big one. Squid fisheries are, the main killers for albatross, but yeah, in general, just try and reduce your seafood. Next slide. Another huge issue, like I said before, they're scavengers. They pick up whatever's on the surface of the water, and they often get confused with plastic. So recently there's been a new disease. It's called plasticosis. And this albatross here died from about 272 pieces of plastic in its stomach. Yeah. Next slide. So this is sort of a Māori proverb that summarizes where I think, where we need to go with our biodiversity. So when the realm of Tane, who's the god of the forest, and the domain of Tangaroa, who is the god of the ocean, are sustained, so too are the people. Next slide. I'm running out of time, so we'll zoom through this one. But yeah, we're just losing our wild spaces. So next slide. Yep, this is a line up to Everest. Next slide. We've got Borneo losing all our forests for palm oil plantations and impacting the poor orangutans. Next slide. South Africa, a lot more agriculture. We're fencing in all the national parks and limiting migration, but also causing a lot of suffering with lack of food with all of these wildlife. Next slide. In New Zealand, so we've got the subantarctics. This is a photo of a lady in a sea lion. Next slide. And this is the Otago Peninsula where I live. Two very similar images. What's the difference? Keep going. This is the Otago Peninsula. So in this photo, this sea lion was walked up by the person. And the next slide, the sea lion approached the person. So totally different. In the subantarctics, no one lives there. They've afforded the highest protection of any national park in New Zealand. In fact, you need to get a permit to even land on those shores. So wildlife essentially they don't know what humans are. You walk on those shores and penguins walk across your feet. Next slide. We'll just skip through this part. But yeah, this is where the subantarctics are. So they're halfway between New Zealand and Antarctica. Keep going. They've been attempted to be settled by humans, but the weather is too extreme that nothing worked. So as a result, keep going. Next slide. We tried to bring livestock on there, but they all died. But about 84% of plant life is only found down there. So it's found nowhere else in the world, and it's home to some of the rarest populations of seabirds in the world. Next slide. So what are some examples of the mainland of New Zealand? Keep going. We're trying to institute more eco-sanctuaries. So a lot of our birds, they can fly in and out of these refuges, but it keeps out all of those invasive land predators. So it's a bit like a zoo, but the wildlife can come and go as it chooses, and you get this beautiful halo effect. Next slide. And as a result, we're bringing back these guys from extinction. Keep going. So just like a zoo, people pay to go in. They get to see rare wildlife, but the wildlife are free. Yeah, it's good. Another example is our wildlife tours. I worked as a guide for these guys for multiple years. This beach here is owned by surrounding farmers, but we lease the land off them and take groups down to the shores. The wildlife, because there's no public, so much less people than your public beaches, so the wildlife loves it. But at the same time, you know, our visitors get a really good experience because they get to see a heap of, you know, creatures that you wouldn't normally. And all of the proceeds from those tours go back to, you know, creating native habitat for them. Next slide. So how does this apply to you? I guess I really wanted to emphasize the interconnectivity of all of these environmental issues. And as land trusts, you know, you're covering such a broad range of issues. You know, the climate, whether it's the climate crisis or, you know, our biodiversity crisis or, you know, expansion of the human race, it all kind of boils down to the same solutions. Next slide. So really quickly, I just want to go through 6 ways forward. This is a really depressing topic, so I've been talking about, but let's try and bring some hope into it. Next slide. So this is number 1. This is the most important thing for me, is developing emotional connections. As a guide for wildlife, before I became a vet, time and time again, I'd take people to see the albatross and I'd see their faces transform from skepticism to utter disbelief. I had people from war-torn countries completely break down in tears because of the sense of peace they experienced when an albatross flew over their head. And that was such a powerful space. When you develop that emotional connection with the environment, when you are surrounded by albatross, by whales, by beautiful mountains, it kind of installs in you that ownership and that need to protect it. And I think, you know, news articles, speeches, you know, your documentaries don't even come close to the power of getting people out there in the environment and, you know, creating those emotional connections. So this next film is really short. It just kind of highlights what I've been talking about as examples, really. Next slide. Oh, it didn't play. It's just down there if you click. Yeah.
So, if I had one question to ask you, what was the time that you felt that you were most connected to the environment?
You come into this perfect circle of foliage and trees hanging around the top and a pool of water and one opening in the side that led back out to the ocean. It was quite a magical place.
I was at the bow and there were maybe 50 albatross just flying around me. And even though I was out there alone, I didn't feel by myself. So what I did is I got up on the bow and I just leant over. And maybe it was like the Titanic scene, I don't know, but that wasn't my intention. All I wanted to do was join them in their flight. And that's what I did.
Just that sense of being able to witness, be part of something that has been happening for such a long period of time. For me, that's that sense of connection to our planet that's what's spiritual for me. I'm not a religious person, but that's where I get my spiritual connection. It's that connection to nature.
And you've got these amazing views. The albatross are doing their special thing in a field of megahertz, and you know how you capture all of that at once is you can't. I mean, I don't think any photo can really convey what you kind of experience in a place like that.
Next. So the second thing is taking the time to learn from your Indigenous, whether it's Māori or your First Nations or down in Australia too. We've all found that, you know, they're based off their values from the environment, and it's very quickly discredited by the Western world. And I think if we really tried to learn from them and establish their concepts into everyday society, that whole cultural transformation would be a bit easier. This next video outlines what a big part of New Zealand is the haka. I may have heard of it before, the tribal war dance. Yeah.
You get brought back down to earth pretty quickly here in the village here in Ohinamatu. Tūranga Waiwai is your belonging place. So my belonging place, for example, is Ohinamatu. I feel the ancestors, I feel the spirits that have been here before. I was born here. When my time is done here, I should also return here to my Tūranga Waiwai. The beginning of haka starts at the beginning of time. Haka is simply a dance that we do prior to battle, back in traditional times. It was used to intimidate your opponent. How we see haka today is usually the aggressive dance that we perform. When we do haka, there's a message within the haka, whether it's a social message or a tribute to somebody. It's a vehicle for us to be able to express ourselves in the present. What was interesting about this particular haka, Taku Tūranga Waiwai Motu haka, which we did for Richie, we went English first. So the first part of the haka actually talks about who we are and where we're from, and that we belong here. We don't own the land, we belong to it. And while we're here, we are the guardians of that land. And the second part of the haka is about the challenges that may arise. So when you do that action, mean it. When you hit that, and you go up there. Well, like, much better.
We thrive on culture, and yes, something that's been around for centuries, probably our whole lifetimes. It's really important to us as Māori.
Just keeping it going too, eh? Yeah. You fellas have got that haka sorted. We got the kupu, we got the words, we got the actions. Ka pai? Now we got to take it to another level, boys. Okay? And that's coming from inside, from in here. Ka pai? In there. So don't leave anything in the tank, boys. From here. Not there, from here. Right? In the lines. Right, let's go. Kia whakata hoki! Boys, good boys, that was much better. I think it's the spirit that when a haka is done well, that's what captures people. And they may not be Māori, but there's something in there that they connect with.
So I'll just wrap it up there, but in summary, really, that's everything I wanted to get across was, those, I don't know if you saw the subtitles of that haka, but that's kind of where we should take forward into the rest of this conference, really. Yeah. I'm here for the rest of the day too, if you want to come and chat about some of those other things I think we can be doing. But I just wanted to take the massive opportunity to say thank you for having me. And given the opportunity for me to come all the way across the globe to meet you all.
Thank you. So it honestly, you know me, you know everything with me, wear the emotions on the sleeve, and it pained me to have to shorten that because it's really remarkable, not only what we heard and what we saw, but who delivered it to us today. And Annie, please accept our gratitude for coming all this way to be with us. One more round of applause. I know we're running late, but I think it's worth it. So before I forget, I want to acknowledge Joy Valenti, who has been here today to assist us with some sign language interpretation, which not sure how many of you needed it, but I'm sure we all appreciated it. So thank you, Joy. And so that does conclude our plenary session. We're running a little bit behind, but I hope you would agree it was worth it. If you'd like to hear more from Annie, she will be participating right now in workshop A1, which is a workshop with young environmentalists from across the state and beyond and the world. And that that workshop is downstairs in Usedan. I'm going, so if you get mixed up, I'll be down there to direct you to the right place. She'll also be available during lunch on third floor, Daniel Family Commons. So after you grab your lunch in the Mink dining room, spread out throughout the building. There's plenty of places downstairs, but there's also an opportunity to go upstairs and meet Andy again and have lunch and run some questions by her and learn more about her remarkable background. And with that, thank you all so much for being here. Have a great day.
Just been for a nice long walk, and I've been talking with everyone and wanting to kind of get across the last few messages that I missed out yesterday. So we finished off with the haka, which resembles connection back to Indigenous culture and trying to bring forward their values into everyday life, because they, at the end of the day, understand connection to the environment, and that's kind of where our cultural transformation is lacking. But leading on from that, the next step is from my Māori culture, got a dog, bringing forward a concept of kaitiakitanga. So in essence, what that means is you are the guardians of the land. We don't own the land, we belong to it, and it's our responsibility to bring it and protect it for future generations. I try and practice that every day, and I am trying to make it known, even if you don't use the word kaitiakitanga, we are all kaitiaki. You in the land trusts are kaitiaki, and you need to keep remembering that when you feel overwhelmed and you feel like the challenges in front of you are too great, because at the end of the day, this is what we're doing it for. The next thing I wanted to bring forward was we need to uphold science. By definition, it is theory that can only be proven by a weight of evidence. There's so many opinions out there that are great, but at the end of the day, science is the thing that allows these policies to be made, and all of this, us bringing forward the environmental argument, it's only relevant if we can back it up with science. The next one I wanted to suggest is the importance of empowering our youth and educating them, getting them out into your land trusts as soon as possible, developing relationships with schools, showing them, giving them a baseline of what the environment is like today, so they can see the changes that are happening in 1, 2, 3, 10 years time, which that is the only way really to make climate change visual, is getting people out there developing that emotional connection, and all the more relevant with children that are malleable and keen and passionate to bring forward the environmental argument. In New Zealand, the school strike for climate has really lifted off again, and I encourage you to try and get that going here as well. You know, empowering those children to take a stand, because they've got very important voices, and they're the ones that are going to have to deal with what we're leaving them in 50 to 100 years. The next one I wanted to bring forward is to nurture our wild spaces. We've all heard about the 30 by 30 target, where we want to protect 30% of our land and 30% of our oceans by the year 2030. Currently we're only sitting at about 17% of our land protected and only 11% of our oceans. That's not good enough. There's a real need amongst the land trusts to, you know, get and protect as much as we can, but I also challenge you that we leave land to rejuvenate on its own. Like, yes, reforestation is hugely important, but I often, it alarms me at how much we are interfering to try and create good outcomes. Nature is hugely resilient if you give it the chance. So we, you know, it's a balance. It's a balance. We need to be going and pulling weeds and getting rid of the invasives, but we, you know, also need to give her a chance to rebalance herself. The next one I wanted to bring forward is when it all becomes too much, remember kotahitanga, which in essence means togetherness. Yesterday there were so many passionate people that are all working together to, you know, preserve these places. We need to stop reinventing the wheel and working together. Often it feels like this environmental argument, it's pushing water uphill, but that's less of an issue if we actually collaborate and, you know, use of all our talents and skills. That's pretty much everything that I wanted to share with you. I wanted to finish my talk with a spoken word, but I have a clip of it from when I presented it to the New Zealand Parliament 2 years ago, so I'll share that with you. And that's, you know, that's how I kind of wanted to leave things. I think in essence it brings forward my message, and yeah, if any of you want to reach out and try and collaborate or have further questions, please don't hesitate. My website, you've got all my contact details there, so yeah, do reach out. Thank you.